Thanks very much to the first panel. It was a great panel, and David was obviously great on discussing things. And I would just say again, yeah, it would be. I suspect the authors would really love to have your slides, David. And I want you to be my discussant in the future on stuff. So panel two. So we're moving from two American politics papers post-Civil War to one American politics and one comparative politics here. So first up would be Mazumder, who is a 2020 PhD from Harvard.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for organizing this conference. Yeah, it's been very interesting to see these papers, and I feel like I've been following a lot of people, the attendees or panelists work for a while, so it's great to see it all in one location. And I just want to also thank Bobby, the discussant, ahead of time for, and hopefully she won't be too harsh on me. All right, so the project is titled Old South, New Deal, How the Legacy of Slavery Undermined the New Deal. Oh. There we go. So just to kind of jump into the motivation. So ideally I would have flown to Los Angeles, which would have been very nice, but that's not the reason I'm showing you an airport. So actually this is LaGuardia, which is one of the most prominent Works Progress Administration or New Deal projects that was built. And so really the question that I'm working with in this paper is understanding, why did some places get these huge kind of expansions of, federal projects, which both required, amassing resources, but also deploying people, labor, from jobs that they may not have had anymore, or transitioned out of during the Great Depression and into these kind of public projects. And what's even more remarkable about this is the fact that it was kind of a huge state-led effort. So in a lot of respects, it's kind of it was one of the periods where people really experienced the reach of the state in a very physical way. So the question that I'm working with in this project is, why did some places see larger exposure to the New Deal rather than others? And specifically, I'm going to be focused on the Works Progress Administration. And I'll outline that for a couple of reasons, but most prominently, it is because the WPA was in charge of kind of building these huge physical manifestations of the state, and in the way in which it undermined some key political economy features of the US South, which is a case I'm going to be focusing on. So the argument that I make in the paper is that the places that were historically exposed or depended on slavery, or really kind of a proxy for coercive economies, were less likely to receive New Deal spending, particularly in the types of projects that would have drawn labor away from the plantation and sucked it into construction, manufacturing, arts, all these other projects. And so the argument is really kind of three steps. So the first one is that these former slave areas perpetuated highly coercive societies. So this is, I think, at this point, a pretty well-established fact that once you lock in a pretty highly coercive equilibrium, so this, coming from Barrington Moore, Asimov Robinson, rich literature in political economy, that once you start off with a coercive society, it's very easy to perpetuate that. In fact, path dependence makes it so that these places kind of remain so, even though that there are opportunities for more productive equilibria. And when you're in this highly coercive structure, this creates incentives for the people benefiting from coercion to maintain a captive labor force. And particularly, one way you do that is reduce the value of exit options. So in a lot of ways, this is through violence. So if you leave the plantation, for instance, which is the case that we're thinking about for the US South, we'll threaten you with violence, or we will not protect you from violence. And in other ways, it's reducing investments and other things that would generate exit options. So the ability of laborers to switch occupations from, let's say, being on the plantation and picking cotton or sugar or some other labor-intensive crop, and potentially going into, the trades, manufacturing, something else. And then kind of the third step of the argument is that New Deal programs, and especially the ones that generated opportunities for exit options, were quite threatening to this equilibrium. So if you come in with these programs, they might suck away your captive or coerced labor force that you had, and therefore threaten your ability to extract rents from your land. And so the case that I'm going to be thinking about is the U.S. South, particularly, and given the role, historical and geographic nature of slavery and kind of planter coercion, the U.S. South kind of makes sense. And there's also some inferential reasons why I use the U.S. focus on the U.S. South, and I'll come to that later in the empirics. And so the data I'm going to use to test this argument, first is very standard, county level data on antebellum exposure to slavery. It's been used in a variety of papers, most notably kind of the research agenda by Acharya, Blackwell, and Sen. So this is coming from the 1860 federal census. And then I'll also combine this with county level data on New Deal spending, not only overall, but broken down by program. And so this is data that Friday's economic historians have been using for quite a while, and they collected it from some books from the New Deal that broke down spending across counties and by program. So just to preview the main findings, so I find that an increase in exposure to slavery decreased Works Progress Administration spending, which is kind of the key threatening program in the US South. And that a good chunk of this variation is explained by areas where incentives for coercion were the highest. So essentially where slavery's impacts seem to be concentrated in areas where they were already depending on coercive labor practices. So I proxy these by sharecropping and tenancy. To validate the assumptions, so I'll use a placebo test of non-Southern counties. And given the empirical strategy I'm using, the North is this place where slavery didn't quite take hold. So by using kind of the reduced form of the instrument on the outcomes, you can back out what was the potential bias from the exclusion restriction. And if anything, it's going to indicate that the results are biased downward, but I won't really focus too much time on that. Some alternative explanation to consider is that potentially, overall in agricultural or in these counties that were historically slave dependent, that we might have just seen less New Deal spending overall. So it's nothing specific about the nature of the WPA or labor coercion. It's just that these places have less demand for New Deal spending. And I showed that in some other analyses that that's not actually the case. So when you look at other programs, there's either no effect or actually they get more money from the government. And I also look at whether it's driven by agricultural counties or non-agricultural counties and don't find substantial evidence for that. So it seems like historical dependence on slavery is kind of a unique role. So I think this connects the two big literature. So the one being around kind of the legacy of slavery in the political economy literature, and will be kind of added in addition to all the other papers that are featured here as well. But I think kind of the key takeaway has been either, a lot of work looking at the impact of slavery on attitudes or the impact of slavery on economic development. And here I think one contribution of the project is to also look at the impact of slavery on kind of the shape or the geographic distribution of the American state as well. The second contribution is this pretty rich literature and at the intersection of race and American political development. So there's quite a bit of studies. I won't go through all of these, but a lot of pages written about the way in which race has uniquely influenced the development of American political institutions. and American political culture over time. And I think this piece is making, one, very, I think, modest contribution to this in trying to quantify the degree to which slavery, in particular, contribute to American political development, particularly during this New Deal time period, of which there's a lot of APD work on. Okay, so just to give you a brief roadmap, so I'll just give you a little bit of background on the New Deal and particularly try to focus on, just giving you some visual representation on what it looked like and also just how the program was administered, which is going to matter for the way in which I set up the argument in the empirical strategy. Then I'll just walk you through the argument and the steps. Kind of at its core, I think the argument is really just trying to combine Katznelson's work and Fear itself, talking about the ways in which Southern legislators really tried to resist the expansion of the New Deal in the US South, and this work in the economic history literature by Alston and Ferry, which talks about the way in which coercive plantations in the US South tried to maintain kind of a paternalistic welfare state. And so they really opposed any external intervention as a way to kind of keep a captive labor force. Then I'll walk through the empirical strategy and the IV, and then present the results and conclude with some brief implications. So the background on the New Deal. So this I thought was really kind of summarized. If you needed to be convinced that the New Deal was a pretty big moment in American political history. So Scotchbaum Feingold write in one of their pieces that the New Deal, along with the national mobilization for World War I and World War II, was a major watershed in the establishment of an economically interventionist national state. And so one reason why the New Deal is a particularly interesting time period to look at is that it's really a huge expansion of the American state, and it manifests it along a variety of dimensions. So a big chunk of the New Deal had to do with basic economic crisis management in the wake of the Great Depression. So the WPA is going to be one part of that combination, but there's also agricultural component to it. There was a major wage component to it, standard setting, kind of industrial and manufacturing were also key components, and also the development of antitrust laws, labor boards, systematizing labor relations in the US. So it's pretty, and alongside a bunch of other kind of welfare state programs, including Social Security, for example. So the New Deal was this very large kind of piece in the development of the American state. And really this project is going to focus on one small chunk of that, the WPA. So the WPA, which was kind of the public works creation. So the idea was that in the wake of the Great Depression, people were out of jobs, unemployment was high. And so the government essentially came in and would fund the creation of public projects itself. And so here from this map, it's just a distribution. So each dot, I'm not sure if you can see this, how well you can see this, but each dot is the location of a WPA project across the eastern United States and central United States. And so you can see that in general, there's quite a lot of dots, but also a huge, quite uneven dispersion of these dots across space. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on this distribution of these projects in the American South, where you can see just kind of visually even, it's quite sparse. But I won't make you do the ocular regression. I'll do the stats for you. So the other component about the WPA was these public works projects also included essentially a big job training component where they would essentially take anyone and they'd put you into completely new job potentially. So you might have been just a general laborer, and then you might have been assigned to construction. You might have been assigned to creating manufacturing. You might have been assigned to arts programs, building schools. So in general, it's a lot of kind of non-agricultural trades that you'd have been trained in. So if you're thinking about it as a planter, this is potentially threatening. Like, you don't really want your workforce being exposed and learning new skills other than what they would need on the plantation. So in this respect, the WPA is quite threatening to the way, the economic and political structure of the American South in a lot of these former, or these kind of cotton-intensive places. And then the second component about the WPA that's particularly interesting in this case is the way in which it was administered. So the way in which you would, let's say you wanted to build a school using WPA funds, the way it would work is that the county would essentially pitch this project saying, we need a school here. Then if the county agrees, they would pitch it to the state, and then the state would sign off on it or not, and then they would pitch it to the federal government, and they would have the final approval on it, whether it would receive WPA funds. And then there's also essentially a local and state matching program where, in order to be majority federally funded, these programs, state and local governments also had to pitch in at least some amount of money. It was around 12% of the cost. So here you can see that the WPA is, essentially mirrors the federal structure of the US government. And the way in which that's going to matter is that's going to give, local level elites a lot of leeway over which projects are going to get pitched to the local WPA board and which ones are, might get accepted or rejected as well. And so in this, the way in which the WPA is administered gives local elites a lot of power over how this is going to get spent and the distribution of spending. So the argument, so the question is, why did some places get more spending while others did not? So as I mentioned before, so reliance on labor oppressive agriculture is path dependent. There's quite a bit of work kind of establishing that fact. And the major, I think really is quite a great study demonstrating this is this paper by Suresh Naidu, looking at the Mississippi floods, which is this, there's this region of the Delta in which it relied really heavily on highly coerced, mainly Black labor. And once kind of a natural disaster hit the location, and then they started rebuilding, they actually switched away from labor repressive agriculture. So really, they were in this really kind of unproductive equilibrium that did benefit a very small and narrow white planter elite. But overall, path dependence led these regions kind of stick to this pretty bad equilibrium. So that's just to kind of make the case that once you set up pretty labor repressive institutions, they're hard to get rid of, absent pretty large shocks. And the way that labor repression really works is that it depends on restricting outside options. So when you think of coerced labor, it's really about the person making the labor or offering the labor contract, reducing the value of other outside options that your labor pool could actually go to. So if you don't have any other outside options, you have no bargaining chip with the planter or the landlord or the elite. And if you don't have bargaining chips, it's hard to get a good offer for your labor. And so this is, I think, kind of the key characteristic of labor repression, or the way I like to conceptualize it. Now, the New Deal is important because it's a huge potential disruption to this equilibrium. So Ira Katz-Nelson notes in his book quite extensively that the New Deal, Southern legislators, while they could have, economically benefited in some ways by, as a whole, coordinating to transition Southern society and industrialize it using New Deal programs. They ultimately did not, because they would reduce their political power in these regions, or at least they anticipated that that would be the case. And so one particular focus on the New Deal, especially the WPA, is that it's creating direct opportunities for Black plantation labor to exit from the cotton fields and move into the cities, for example, or just move away in general and into different occupations that are potentially less labor repressive. And so if you're thinking from the perspective of the white planter class, you really don't want to see a whole lot of New Deal or WPA presence in your locality if it's going to draw away this kind of captive labor market that you have. So kind of the hypothesis or the core empirical test is going to be that areas with more exposure to slavery, which is going to be this kind of this proxy for this dependence on labor oppressive agriculture, they should have lower WPA spending. And so kind of the main result is going to be testing the impact of historical slavery on spending. Sorry, that's a typo. And then to understand whether this labor coercion mechanism that's going on, I'm going to use a mediation analysis. And I know there are kind of, there are lots of reasons to take pause with mediation, but I think for here, it's kind of a nice descriptive exercise just to get a benchmark for how much kind of this labor coercion story is going to matter. And as I mentioned, the data source, and just to remind you, is going to come from the US federal census. So the key explanatory variable will be this 1860s slave proportion in a county. And then I'll also be looking at New Deal spending as the outcome, particularly WPA spending. And so the empirical strategy I'm going to use, so this is really just drawing the empirical spec from Acharya, Blackwell, and Sen. So I'm not doing anything super crazy here, but I'll try to do some of the validation needed for it. So really kind of in an ideal setting, you'd have some sort of encouragement or randomized encouragement to have more slave-dependent agriculture in some places or not, and then we could use this to instrument for the actual amount of reliance on slavery. And so following this literature, I'm going to be using cotton suitability. So the places where it made sense kind of from geographic fundamentals to have more kind of slave-dependent agriculture. And I mean, this is purely from an economic sense. Obviously, from a moral sense, this is very disconnected from that. But just thinking in terms of the planter, their incentives to draw on labor repressive or slave labor is going to be higher in places where it's more suitable for labor-intensive production, particularly cotton. And then the other assumption here is going to be exclusion. So cotton being suitable for growing cotton itself shouldn't have any effect on WPA spending except through this kind of slavery channel. And so one kind of key threat to inference is that you might think, general agricultural places just have less need for WPA spending, and that has nothing to do with slavery at all. And so I'll try to present a falsification test to see how much this actually might be driving the results. And in terms of controls, I'll be having some environmental or kind of geographic controls in there. So water and land area, and then also polynomials of longitude and latitude following this literature. And then I'll have some kind of bare bones demographic controls, population, urbanicity, et cetera, and economic controls to get at proxies for the agriculture, more general agricultural nature. of a county. And then also have state fixed effects in there, mainly for kind of power reasons, but it also will help adjust for any potential differences between states. So just to kind of visually show you the first stage relationship, so the x-axis is going to be cotton suitability, and the y-axis is the proportion enslaved in 1860. So you can see in general, there's a positive association. So the red dots are these binned means, and then the red line is the linear regression line. So you can see it's not a perfectly linear relationship, and I try to do some extra modeling to see how much that actually matters. It turns out that it doesn't, but in general, I just wanted to show you this is kind of the general pattern you see. So places that are more suitable for cotton tend to be more highly slave dependent. So using this instrument, so I'm going to look at the impact of slave reliance in 1860 on WPA spending in 1930. And so column 2 is just going to present the OLS regression. So you can hear there's a negative correlation. So places that were more dependent on slaves tended to get less WPA spending per person. And then when you instrument for it, so in columns 3 and 5, you see that that coefficient increases in magnitude. Part of that, could be just because, IV is a ratio and that artificially will inflate any beta coefficient through 2SLS. But it could also be that the selection process is actually underestimating the true effect as well. But kind of the general pattern is that it remains negative and statistically significant. Just to give you kind of the economic terms for what this would mean. So if you go from a place that's really basically barely dependent on any slaves to a place that's pretty highly dependent on slaves, that generates into about $31 less per capita. So given the low population in these places and the adjusting for how much a day's wage would be, I think that's pretty economically meaningful as well. So how much of this story is really about labor coercion? So the next exercise that I'll look at is kind of a mediation analysis. So trying to see how much of this effect is explained via these proxies for kind of more coercive societies in the contemporary period, so in 1930. So one proxy is going to be sharecropping and the other one is going to be tenancy. So looking at this, so starting with the bottom panel, that's kind of the basic vanilla OLS coefficient. And then when you look at the control direct effect, so netting out any effect of sharecropping or any effect via tenancy, the coefficient reduces by about half. So it seems that there's a substantial amount of this variation explained by labor coercion, but not all. So I'm definitely, don't want to push this labor coercion story so much as the only explanation, but it does seem to be at least a substantial one. There is a difference between the ATE and the average control direct effect. So some robustness checks that I run. So the first one is thinking about threats to the IV strategy. So I run a falsifications test looking at the reduced form impact of cotton suitability in non-southern counties, so places that really weren't slave dependent, if at all, or had no opportunity to be really slave dependent, and looking at the relationship between WPA spending and cotton suitability in these non-southern counties. And if anything, this test leads me to conclude that these estimates are actually underestimating the true impact. So at least from this, it doesn't seem that the exclusion restriction per se is a key threat to inference using that test. The other threat is just kind of the modeling approach to the IV. So as I mentioned before, if you looked at the first stage in graphical terms, there is a bit of nonlinearity there. So using lasso selected polynomials of cotton suitability to try to better model that relationship between cotton suitability and the proportion enslaved in 1860. Adjusting for that doesn't seem to do a whole lot to the results either. So it doesn't seem to be driven by model specification. For the mediation analysis, I follow kind of standard procedure and use a sensitivity analysis to think about how much confounding does there need to be in the relationship between the mediator and the outcome to get, push the result to 0. It has to be quite high. So I'm not discounting, so the study here isn't really designed to get a tight causal estimate of that labor coercion channel, but at least suggests that it does seem to be at play. And then I also consider some alternative explanations. So whether this is really about general decreases in New Deal spending overall. So maybe it has nothing to do with the WPA or this labor coercion story about how the WPA generates exit options for laborers in the US South, particularly in these coercive societies. If that were the case, then you would just see a negative impact between proportion enslaved and these other New Deal spending programs as well. And that doesn't seem to be the case. In most cases, it's either not predictive of other program spending, such as the Civil Works Administration, which is completely federal in its administration, or even positive for some other programs. The second being whether it's about just the general orientation of agricultural counties. So nothing really particularly about slavery per se, but just that agricultural counties in general tend to need the types of projects that the WPA was working on less. That doesn't seem to be the case. So one way I did this is try to find as many proxies for how agricultural that county is. So farm values, the amount of land devoted, farm productivity, and controlling for these proxies doesn't seem to really affect the results. And then finally, in some earlier versions of this work, it had been brought, one story that Katz-Nelson and co-authors really push is the role of committee memberships and kind of congressional log rolling in the politics of New Deal spending. And so I tried to, in one sense, this could be a mechanism, and in another sense, it could be alternative explanation. But thinking about this as an alternative explanation, so it has nothing to do with slave-dependent counties. It's just that these counties also happen to be key committee players or have key committee assignments in Congress that allowed for controlling more or less spending in these areas. That doesn't seem to be the case either. So again, I don't want to push this labor coercion or labor oppression story as the single explanation, but it does seem to be an important one in explaining New Deal spending in the South. Okay, so to conclude, so the main question that we started with is why did some places get more New Deal spending rather than others, and particularly the WPA, given kind of its importance as a federal program and a pretty physical manifestation of the American state. So the argument, I think, is really kind of a combination of this Alston Ferry hypothesis and Katz-Nelson, which is about Southern planter elites essentially want to maintain a coerced and captive labor force that's largely Black. And in order to do that, they need to ward off any threats from the federal government that would potentially undermine their ability to control their labor pool. And so you see this from the results manifesting in terms of high exposure counties to slavery tend to have much less New Deal spending to the WPA. So some implications. So one, I think this continues kind of this APD literature about the way in which slavery is really kind of fundamental to the development of the American state. Robin Einhorn, I think most directly talks a lot about this in her book, about the way in which slavery shaped tax policy. So if you think about why is the US South largely, and kind of the federal government as well, unable to collect taxes, slavery is kind of a key explanation. Here, I think I'm doing something much more period specific. So just thinking about the New Deal period, which we have at one point, this huge expansion of the state, but the other way, it's highly uneven, and slavery, the legacy of slavery seems to matter in the way in which it's uneven. And then there's this kind of more descriptive point even, is that Rob Mickey in his book makes this point that white Southern elites operated very much like a subnational authoritarian government. And some of my other work in my dissertation, I kind of probe this from a lot of other aspects of thinking about political repression, political violence. And here I'm thinking about it the way in which state building happens as well. And I know state building is kind of a big word, and I think there's only, this here is really only a small piece of it and not kind of a full perspective. So I do think it's potentially productive to think about the way in which slavery shapes state building in the American South. And especially it's really about when white planter elites can feasibly control these conditions. So in some other work that I have, I look at the way in which huge shocks, such as the bull weevil manifestation or infestation, and in Suresh's work, looking at the Mississippi River flooding, so these huge kind of natural shocks, essentially removing the ability of planters to maintain a repressed labor force, and essentially that actually moves them to industrialize and move away from a repressive equilibrium. Okay, so I think that's it, and thank you again for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. So we're going to do both papers and then do the discussants afterwards. So the second paper is by Vanessa Buhaj and Adil Malik, and Adil is going to be presenting the paper.
So this paper is a very simple extension of Nathan Nunn's foundational work on slavery and the long-run effects of slavery. But we hope that this is a non-trivial extension. So we just started it for fun, but we're now developing it, in the process of developing it further. We are going to take this context away from America, sort of countries that imported slaves, and more towards countries that exported slaves. And we are interested in a relatively understudied dimension, especially with respect to countries that exported slaves. I hope most people here in this audience are aware of this work by Nathan Nunn, who established long-run effects of slavery on income. It did not provide a lot of evidence on mechanisms, but there's growing evidence that ethnic fractionalization and Nunn's latest work on trust, that slave exports sort of undermine trust in some of these exporting societies. The second wave of work spawned a series of studies on how slavery affected income inequality, it affected human capital, being a key mechanism for that, and how there's been intergenerational transmission of human capital. A lot of this work is focused on the role of race, labor market institutions, and human capital in the United States. So a number of studies that raise that point in this context. Now, there is some work from developing countries, particularly Colombia, where Asimoglu talked about municipalities with greater slavery in the colonial period suffering from lower secondary enrollment rates. There's also a lot of other literature that talks about the impact of slavery on ethnic stratification, income inequality, poverty, but we don't have a direct empirical investigation on the impact on human capital outcomes. And this is what we set out to do. We look at, we try and extend Nunn's framework and look at the impact of slavery on long-run human capital, particularly literacy and health. And our main contribution really is to be able to demonstrate that the slave exports, countries that were exporting more slaves, had witnessed effects not just on income, but also on education. And this impact on lower education, the impact of slavery in lowering education, is over and above its effect on income, institutions, geography, trust, these sort of classic explanations for slavery and underdevelopment. So there's sort of direct impact. We also show that whilst Nunn's results were substantially attenuated and weakened with the inclusion of an important health measure, malaria ecology, at least our cross-country results remain robust to controlling both for malaria ecology as well as patterns of European settlement, which could have shaped long-run patterns of human capital accumulation. We do explore mechanisms, but given the small data size, it's very preliminary. But it does point to health being an interesting mediating channel. Okay, so let us begin with the sort of very basic, simple association between literacy. Here you have literacy in the year 2000. I could actually replace it with 2010, modern data, exactly the same patterns. And we find that, log of exports scaled by area on the x-axis. And you find, much like Nunn's original paper, we find a sort of very strong negative correlation. So next, we took this correlation to Nunn's models. He presents ordinary least squares models. He presents IV models. We replicate that framework with literacy as the dependent variable and find that even after controlling for income, slavery has long-run impacts on literacy. So we are going to show you some basic regressions. And the model we are going to follow is very similar to that of Nunn. We're sort of regressing income, we are regressing literacy, and the sort of standard sort of variables apart from slavery, you have longitude, rain indicators, coastal indicators, legal origin dummies, colonial origin dummies, so on and so forth. Our two main differences that we introduce here is one is obviously the share of European settlers in 1900, because early settlement patterns meant that Europeans brought with them not just the good institutions that Soumyajit and others talk about, but also better human capital. And it's a point that Glaser et al. And Rajan and Zingales also make. We also add malaria ecology as an additional control, both for its effect on mortality and fertility, and therefore investments in education for the long term. Right. So when we sort of very simple, plain vanilla replication of Nunn's framework, we find that slave exports are strongly negatively correlated with literacy, contemporary literacy. And all a standard set of controls. Some of them are shown here. Others are sort of colonizer fixed effects that we're including. Exactly the same table that Nunn presents, with the difference that we're also adding malaria ecology, which, as column 2 shows, has a strong negative impact, and European settlers, and together both are quite strong determinants of literacy rate. Now the effects do go down. Obviously, the magnitude of these effects reduces when we add both of these variables in column 4. But by and large, what we find is that there is a sort of very strong, significant long-run impact of slave exports on literacy. Now, our first table actually controls for per capita income as well, just to demonstrate that these effects are over and above income. But it could be a bad control, so we are not including in remaining columns. So that's our starting point. Then we proceed to presenting IV estimates. And again, I'm assuming that most of our audience here is aware of the framework in Nunn's paper, QJE paper, where they use distance from different types of slave routes, sort of different routes through which slaves were exported. So the distance of each country from that. And we first use the 4 instruments as they use, and then 3 instruments, one of which is not very significant, it's the Red Sea distance. And the IV estimates, again, sort of reinforce the same message. The slave exporting countries witnessed a long-run deficit in terms of literacy. We then started thinking about what sort of mechanisms might underpin this. And we tried a number of different mechanisms, and we don't have as fancy a mediation analysis as shown, but we are in the process of doing that. But we did some very simple things that economists do just to explore mechanisms by adding these variables on the right-hand side and using them as dependent variables as well. Now, of course, we are really talking about 49, 50 countries. So there are limitations on what type of mediation analysis you could do, but it does point us to interesting possibilities. So one is health, which we try out, which is an important correlate of literacy. We also find that places that exported more slaves witnessed a deficit in urbanization, and they also had a higher share of agriculture value added, and that sort of chimes in well with some of the literature that talked about the longue durée impacts of depopulation as one of the key negative externalities of slave trade. So here are two scatter plots. I mean, the first one plots average life expectancy at independence against the slave trade measure. The plot on the right is urbanization at independence, and both of them sort of depict a very strong negative correlation between these two variables. And then in our mediation analysis, what we do in the first panel is to basically successively add these variables on the right-hand side. So, one of the key explanations that Nunn offered was that ethnic fractionalization is one of the mechanisms through which there's a negative effect, just like in Nunn's paper, but it doesn't come up as a very strong predictor. In column 3, we add our urbanization measure. Column 4, we replace it with an agricultural value added because both are highly correlated. The third column, we add the sort of a principal components measure of urbanization, agricultural value added. All of these are sort of significant on their own, and they knock out the impact of slavery on education. In the second panel, we look at the role of life expectancy. And similarly, when you add life expectancy to the model, it sort of takes away the slavery impact on literacy. In panel C, we treat life expectancy as the dependent variable and show that actually slavery is a strong predictor of life expectancy at birth as well. And all of these progressions sort of robust to controlling for income levels. Now, we do in our paper also rule out a number of other potential explanations, the role of religion, different types of political institutional measures, measures of conflict, and they don't appear to be the primary mechanisms for this. So that's so much for our cross-sectional work. Now, with the first draft, we received some interesting comments on the extent to which we can use slave trade data at the level of ethnicity and correlate it with educational levels using individual respondent survey data. So to do that, what we did, and it's something we are in the process of doing, but I'm going to present you some very simple patterns that are emerging from that work. We replicate now Nunn and Vanchikon's work, which, if you might recall, is basically looking at trust. Is it the case? Because Nunn's original paper did not present a mechanism, and this is a mechanism paper in which they argue, well, if your ethnicity had greater slaves exported, you'll have less trust in neighbors, less trust in other communities, in your own communities. And they use Afrobarometer survey, the 2005 wave, with about 17 countries. In each country, around 1,200 to 2,400 individuals are selected for this survey. They're nationally representative. What we do is we sort of replace their dependent variable, which is a trust indicator, with an educational indicator, which, like their trust indicator, is a categorical measure for education 0 to 9. So 0 is no education, and then 1 is with some informal education, and so on and so forth. And so it's increasing in the levels of education. Now, overall empirical setup is the same. They deploy different types of variation. So for example, they look at its individual respondent data. So there are controls that you could control for individual level characteristics, ethnic groups, district level characteristics, colonial characteristics. So it allows us a more granular level to explore the impact of slavery on education. You can control for a wide range of factors like political, geographic, cultural, individual characteristics. So we set out to doing this, and before we present, we want to take you through a set of controls that this allows us. So we have individual respondent data from Afrobarometer survey. And so we have the individual's age, the square of that age, a gender indicator variable, 5 living condition variables, a couple of religion fixed effects, 25 occupation fixed effects, indicator for whether the respondent is in the urban area. So all of those are sort of individual level controls. And then we've got district level controls, which talk about the sort of ethnic fractionalization in that district, or the share of the population that belongs to the same ethnicity as that of the respondent. And importantly, because this analysis is carried out at the level of ethnicities, we have lots of ethnicity level controls. So, for example, we have the prevalence of malaria, which is very useful for this exercise. We have the urbanization indicator, fixed effects for the type of pre-colonial settlements, the type of political hierarchies that existed beyond community, the type of colonial sort of infrastructure network, like rail network, indicators for contact with pre-colonial European explorers, and another variable which is going to be very important for literacy, which is the number of missions per square kilometer during colonial rule. So a lot of this work is really ongoing and quite preliminary, but at least you get a sense of where I'm going. And this is, again, with due apologies to our discussant who hasn't seen some of these new results, because I've been trying to work around with these over the last couple of days. Okay, so here are some basic patterns. So this is all sort of individual respondent level data aggregated at the level of districts. So these are like 1,800, more than 1,800 districts across these 17 countries. And you find that, log of slave exports, there are 3 different types of measures in Nunn's work. There's the sort of measure of slave exports per area, localized exports. The first measure is more about whether there have been exports of slaves or how many exports from your own ethnicity. Whereas the second measure is more about localized, how many exports from the area where you're residing currently. And then the third, which I present here, which is quite significant in some of the initial regression work, is historic population. So this is basically at the start of the colonial period, you have some population numbers, so you can compute log of slave exports per historic population. And you find this is unconditional, some very simple plain scatter plot, which shows you a negative correlation between education levels, right, and slave exports. You also find, and I think this is an important part of this exercise, sort of malaria ecology is higher in regions where you see greater slave exports. And that, again, is going to be, it's an important health dimension, and it would be, it seems like an important category to control for. So I'm going to show you results both with malaria exports and with malaria ecology, as well as without malaria ecology. Okay, so here are some simple OLS regression results that we've just started with. And so this whole regression table is pretty much very similar setup as Nunn. And the first 3 columns show you clustering by districts, and the last 3 columns are district and ethnicity. So much of this data is by ethnicity, and they used Murdoch's ethnicity map to create different types of ethnicity clusters. There are 187 ethnicity clusters. And so the slave exports measure is by that cluster. So within your slave exports per area is basically slave exports from your ethnicity per area. The second measure, localized slave exports, which Nunn introduces to distinguish between the effects of internalized effects of slavery, which is that if you belong to an ethnicity which has witnessed a lot of slave exports versus if you are in an area where there's a lot of slave being exported. And the latter might help us to distinguish the localized, fixed geographic, political effects of slavery versus more internalized, norm-based effects. And the third measure is the one I presented before, is the slave exports per capita. And each of these regressions, the dependent variable is the sort of education variable, which is a categorical scale. The larger the number, the higher the level of education, as 9 being postgraduate. There are about 1,292 districts, at 187 clusters. A lot of the controls that I've mentioned, all of them are included here: the district controls, the individual controls, occupation, etc., ethnicity level controls, including the colonial controls. Now, if you look at column 1, we do find a very strong negative impact of slave exports. So if there's been greater export of slaves from your ethnicity per area, scaled by the area, total size of the area, you see that education levels are lower for those respondents. The effect is stronger when you just focus on the localized slave measure, which is how many slaves or what was the proportion of slaves as a proportion of that area that was exporting slaves in that area rather than in that ethnicity. And that this is just scaled by historic population. All of these give us a negative, statistically significant impact on education. Now, if you cluster by district and ethnicity, because it's possible that there's correlation, within ethnicity correlation as well as within district correlation. So two-way clustering of standard errors. The exports per area measure is, you have the same sign, but it's not, and it's negative, but it's not statistically significant. But the other two measures retain their negative sign and are statistically significant. So there's some sense that there's a negative correlation that we are able to preserve from this rather fine-grained data from Afrobarometer survey. Now, all of this is without malaria ecology. When we add malaria ecology, the results weaken a bit. And in fact, per area measure is weaker. The other two measures tend to survive, but the only measure where you still find a consistent impact is the slave exports per capita. The others are sort of wiped away. So seems like malaria ecology, health dimension is important at this level. Now, the number of things that we are doing at this stage, because this is just OLS, we are going to use IV, and we are also thinking of actually creating different types of variables from this education variable. So rather than using respondent level data, we can collapse it to districts and look at the proportion of respondents within a district who have never educated or who have less than secondary education. So all those, they would still give us enough observations to work with, but at least we are able to control for a large number of factors there as well. So that's where it's going. We're also exploring if we could use some demographic and health survey data to further elaborate on this. But overall, I think what this paper does is a very simple, basic extension of Nunn's work, but we hope it is non-trivial in the sense that it's suggesting that there is a long-run impact of slavery over and above the role of income, institutions, geography, other sort of factors, at least in the cross-country data. Regions that historically exported more slaves have lower literacy today, and the sub-regional suggests that there is a similarly strong correlation, but a correlation that does not necessarily survive the inclusion of malaria ecology, which shows that the effect of education and health are sort of bound together when it comes to slavery. So look forward to having more reaction and comments and feedback from that. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Adil. Okay, so we have two papers and we have two discussants. So one discussant per paper. Pavi Suyanarayan from Hopkins and Dozie Okoye from Dalhousie. Pavi will take Sham's paper, and Dozie will take Vanessa and Adil's paper. Pavi?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to join this day-long symposium and hear about this wonderful set of papers, and also for the opportunity to read this really terrific paper. You know, in this paper makes a very sort of neat and really important contribution. First and foremost, it argues that there's a link between slavery and how the New Deal unfolded in the American South. And it argues that the historic intensity of slavery shaped the extent of the New Deal's very local success at the county level. And the argument of the paper goes as follows. Elites worked to prevent labor market alternatives for African Americans in order to maintain a cheap pool for coercive forms of economic gains, primarily agriculture, is my reading. And the study it studies the determinants of per capita county level spending, focusing on one particular program, the WPA, and shows that places with greater levels of historic slavery are likely to be places where there were coercive institutions that created this loop of needing cheap, captive labor. And it finds that correlation and shows that historic intensity of slavery is associated with weaker spending during the New Deal, specifically on this WPA program. And it instruments for slavery using cotton growing conditions. And so there are key elements to this story that I think are very important and jump out as you read this paper. The first is the extent to which the New Deal programs took control away from local elites and gave them to federal decision makers. And so one argument is that the federal control of New Deal programs prevented local officials from, in my sense, implementing these programs selectively. The more the federal government controlled things, the less the local elites could do anything about it. So it created incentives to undermine the programs en masse. Right, and it contrasts this story of labor coercive institutions against other possible reasons for why you might observe the same patterns, focusing on stories about distributive politics, co-partisanship, geographic story of agriculture, and finds that it's very likely that this labor coercion story has some metal to it. So I'm going to focus on three things in this paper that I think need greater clarification and possibly, need a little bit more convincing to the reader, right? So the first is, was it slavery as such, or is it the kinds of institutional developments that happened between slavery and the New Deal, right? So, recent work, including Jeff and Mario's work, my own with Stephen White, all of this show that, the Reconstruction and Redemption eras that occur before the institution of formal Jim Crow sort of laws were a period of tremendous institutional upheaval. So you have both an initial contraction and then an expansion and then a contraction of local bureaucratic quality, bureaucratic institutions to deliver on a range of things, including taxation and redistribution, right? So one question I had is this a lingering effect of institutional decline at the local level, which of course is linked to historic levels of slavery, but the mechanism through which this is happening is a decline in institutions in the post-Civil War era, precisely as a strategy for elites to prevent the kinds of things that New Deal is bringing, right? And can we parse these mechanisms? In what way is this important to your story? Well, I would think that what you're pushing for is the institutional consequences of slavery. The first of those are labor arrangement, but the knockoff effects of those are the kinds of overall redistributive institutions that get created at the local level. And so it would really be helpful to get, some clarity from you on what is the New Deal doing in terms of the local bureaucracies? How are these programs being administered? What is the story here that conforms to your labor coercion channel rather than other ways in which you might observe similar outcomes? So that was one question I had. The second is, the one thing that this made me think about as a comparativist is similar studies in another context where you have similar outcomes, and that's South Africa, right? And so here you see very coercive labor laws towards Black, clear geographic and institutional segregation. All of these serve to give poor whites greater leverage in labor markets. And so my question for you is, if many poor whites were going to be benefiting from the New Deal's programs, and especially the WPA, why did they give this up, right? So what are the trade-offs here that the planter elites are making with poor whites or low-income whites who might also be, benefiting from the New Deal era? And so to that extent, to me, this graph that you show and the substitution of, your WPA dependent variable with other types of spending was a little bit confusing. So I wasn't quite clear on what intuitions I would have about programs that were administered differently than the WPA. Would you imagine actually the flip, where you actually get very strong, good results as long as local elites could selectively channel the benefits to whites only? And were places where they couldn't do this the places where you're going to see the strongest negative effects, because the federal government is ensuring that you cannot discriminate by race on who the recipients are, right? And I bring up South Africa here because, I think here, drawing on the work of Evan Lieberman, who tells a story of better redistribution in South Africa over a shared white identity. And so the question I have, as I mentioned earlier, is, is flipping who controls the program going to flip the sign? And is that important for the kind of story you're telling? And is it important to have a coalition story about labor coercion where white laboring classes are just as much in cahoots with the planter class because they know they get better labor terms when there is a captive, coerced Black population being forced to work at a certain type of pay in certain types of jobs, okay? And the final thing is, I have big concerns about, the cotton suitability variable here. Because in my mind, you could tell a very simple story that goes as follows, right? Cotton suitability gives you conditions for coercive labor agriculture. And so you could write a paper where you could straight up say that cotton suitability should be associated with any attempts by the government to give labor alternatives. And you should have results in any area which has good cotton suitability, but you get even worse results where that cotton suitability is coupled with a very specific type of historic coercive labor institutions such as slavery, right? And so it seems to me that cotton suitability wouldn't meet your exclusion restriction. And two, it wasn't clear to me why these placebo tests are showing what they're showing. If labor coercion is such a central part of your story, it should apply to any sort of context where the underlying economic logic is one that relies on cheap, coerced labor, right? Anything that's super labor intensive and can benefit from coerced labor should be showing the same findings. And so again, it brings me back to what is doing the work here. Is this really an argument about labor coercion, or is this an argument about white versus Black labor's trade-offs and what kinds of deals are being made in a coalitional sense? And to that extent, I had one suggestion, which is to really probe the extent to which intra-white inequality varies in this area, and whether that has any interactions with the extent of Blacks historic slavery. So is intra-white inequality pushing against what you're thinking of as a white planter's ability to get away with not administering these benefits to historically enslaved areas? But on the whole, this was a terrific paper. Thank you for the opportunity to read this, and I hope these comments were useful.
Okay, you'll have a chance to respond, but let's bring in Dozy for paper number 2.
All right, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be a paper of this symposium. I've learned quite a bit today, and so I'll be discussing the paper presented by Adil and on slavery and human capital in Africa. which is an extension and kind of a deeper investigation of the finding. From the outset, I read the original paper, which we didn't have the we didn't have the results from the Afrobarometer survey. So most of my comments will be related to that. But I'll also mention points that could also apply to the subnational study using the Afrobarometer data set. So basically, the main result is that historical exposure to Africa's slave trades. Okay, so this is the transatlantic slave trade and also the trans-Saharan slave trade associated with lower educational attainment today. Okay, some of the effects or some of the findings could be explained and at least in an empirical sense, through decreases in life expectancy and urbanization rates. So, and then obviously this kind of supports and corroborates the finding from the paper on the effect of slave trade on economic performance. I have about 5 general points that I would like to discuss, and hopefully I'll be able to keep the time. So the first point is broader. While reading the paper, one thing that occurred to me is that there's really there's no historical discussion to support, like to explain why this would be an issue, in the sense that yes, there was the slave trade, and it ended sometime in the 19th century, and then after that, these countries were formed. Okay, these countries didn't really exist back then. They were formed, and lots of things have happened since then. You know, Christian missions have come. They introduced. They were responsible for introducing education in several African countries, maybe in most African countries. These countries have gone through, you know, democracies, civil wars, all sorts of issues. Is there something in the history somewhere that suggests, maybe from contemporary accounts, that exposure to the slave trade has something to do with acceptance of education, or the ability to organize, to build schools? This is important because in a paper I have, so just apologies for plugging my own study, but in a paper we have that focused on Nigeria, one interesting thing, at least in West Africa, was that places that had greater exposure to the slave trade also had greater exposure to Christian missions and were more accepting of education. The reason being that for many freed slaves that were settled in the Caribbean and in Sierra Leone and Liberia, they were instrumental and they lobbied for Christian missions to visit their homelands and introduce them to Western education. So in this context, you find that exposure to the slave trade in some areas was actually linked to greater educational attainment. Again, but the link is exposure to Christian missions. So obviously, this is in one region in West Africa. So it would be good to have a historical discussion on, say, what happened in Central Africa, what happened in East Africa, what happened in South Africa. Why is it that in West Africa, places that were exposed to the slave trade, which are kind of on a subnational level, these are the most prosperous places in West Africa today. These are places that are closer to the coast. Why do we have that finding? But in East Africa, why is the result the reverse? So these are kind of things that would be good to have in the paper, beside the empirical discussion. And so the second comment is, I think obviously there's been quite a few follow-ups to non-paper with some critiques. And I think it will add, there'll be some added value in responding to critiques of the non-paper. One critique, I think from Botero and Wallace from 2013, is that the effects in the non-paper don't show up prior to 1970. Okay, and so this is something that would be good to investigate. Do the effects on education show up prior to 1970? And so this could be, I mean, you could use the demographic and health surveys to look at the effects on people who were born, say, in 1960 and 1950 to see if the same effects are there. And then another issue, at least for the instrumental, the IV estimates, is looking at whether the instruments are actually truly exogenous, okay? Because distance to ports, distance to sea, will also be correlated with trade, okay? These ports are also, some of them are also major ports today. They could be related to trade. They could be related to the arrival of Christian missions, and then they could also be related to some geographic characteristics that might have direct effects on development today. So I think it would be good to have some additional arguments beyond what's in the non-paper to defend the instrument used. My third comment has to do with specification. Okay, so this is generally for cross-country regressions in Africa. Should countries be weighted by population size? All right. So should we look at Nigeria with 200 million people as one country, and then with, say, Botswana or some other country with, say, 1 million people? Should we say place them, or should we have the same weights on them, or should the countries be weighted by population size? So this is a kind of open question. The paper has a North Africa fixed effect, but I think the paper should have basically a full set of fixed effects for North Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa, because all of these regions have their own unique experiences and histories, if you will. So this kind of also applies to the Afrobarometer study. I at least from the slides, I didn't see country fixed effects. So I think that would be something to include as well, because the Non and Wanchekon study also they include country fixed effects. All right, and then for the instrumental variable regressions, the statistics are extra. The standard measure is that they should be less than 10, and there are recent papers that argue that the F-stat should be 120 or some number. But anyway, the F-stat here is very low. It's about 2 or 3 in some cases. So is there a weak instrument problem? And if so, perhaps you could use the Rubin confidence intervals. Okay, I think the Anderson-Rubin confidence intervals to see if the result remains robust. And then on this point, I think some attention should also be paid to what's now known as bad controls. Okay, in 2008, this was not a major issue, but today it's become an issue. Basically, bad controls are variables that are included as control variables when they're actually when they're best treated as outcomes. Okay, things like European settlers or institutional constraints, or in the subnational data, things like living conditions, occupation. So these are things that could be that are actually, basically, these are things that are contemporary results and should not really be controlled. And then effects on schooling. Okay, so ideally, we want to control for factors that we want to control for factors that have not been influenced by the slave trade. So those are kind of the pure controls, and obviously it's more difficult, I guess. But so anyway, so some thoughts on the mechanisms. I didn't quite understand why agriculture value added and urbanization were included as plausible channels, because from the paper itself, it seems like depopulation, okay, would support, say, using population density as a mechanism and not urbanization, because population density and urbanization are not quite the same things, right? So anyway, so that's a comment, and I strongly believe that there should be some control, okay, for Christian missionary for Christian missions. The version of the paper I read basically said that basically the data was only available for 24 countries or something. So perhaps you could explore some other sources, okay, of data for the presence of Christian mission. So this is important because Christian missions were primarily responsible for introducing Western education in many countries, and in many places they basically followed the same route as the slave ships. Okay, so there might be some correlation there, and it's something that needs to be adequately accounted for. And then on malaria ecology, I'm wondering, is this a mechanism, or is it some geographic characteristic that's related to both the slave trade and current development? Okay, because you could again the areas that were most exposed to the slave trades tend to be coastal. Okay, and it could also be that these areas have higher exposure to malaria. And okay, so I mean, so I think it would be good to properly explain the role that the role being played by malaria ecology here. Is it a mechanism or a driver of both the slave trade and current development? And if so, how can you handle that? And lastly, in the cross-country results, in at least table 5 in the paper I read, the estimates kind of disappear when excluding countries with zero slave trade. Okay, so I was thinking to myself, what does this imply? Does this imply that intensity itself is not important? Okay, because it appears that when we look at countries with some slave trade, okay, the intensity itself does not really matter. Okay, if intensity does not matter, what does this imply for the mechanisms? Okay, and it would also be good to know what these zero slave trade countries are. Okay, because if we knew the countries, we might be able to at least take a guess at what the implications of this finding, what we're going to kind of take a guess on as to what the implications are. So those are kind of my 5 broad comments, and so thank you for the interesting paper.
Thank you, Dozie. And I suspect the authors of both papers would love to get the slides. So if Pavi and Dozie could forward those, I think they appreciate it. Do the authors want to respond at all? Sham, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, I don't know how much time we have.
A couple minutes. How about that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I won't go into anything much other than saying just like, yeah, thank you so much for these comments. They're very, yeah, they're great. Stuff to chew on even beyond this project as well. Especially, I've been thinking about that South Africa and US South comparison so much. I've never got around to really doing a whole lot with it, but it's good other people are also thinking about that because I just think it's like so apparent as well. The one thing I will say is I think kind of the other type of channel I think probably brings up is really about like coalitions and thinking about incentives, which is, you know, the story that I'm pushing here is really almost bilateral. It's a game between the planter elite and, you know, Black laborers mainly, but, you know, there are also poor white laborers, and there's some really great recent historiographical work on that subject. And so I don't want to leave them out. I think the main thing is it's not really clear to me in my reading of the New Deal history and the time period and some of the primary sources, just how exactly that coalition work played out in this story. So in theory, I see what you mean about, you know, essentially like, why would they, you know, they're clearly, you know, poor white laborers are also paying a cost, foregoing these types of programs. So why would they, you know, not revolt and kick out the planter guys? And I think, you know, part of it, you know, could be about this, you know, Du Boisian, you know, psychological wages of whiteness idea that there are just lots of other benefits that the elite are going to be giving above and beyond this. So just having privileged social status. And I know, you know, a lot of your work focuses on this concept of social status, which I don't think I really quite engaged with, could do more to in this work. But that's one explanation. The other one just being that they're, you know, poor whites just didn't really have a credible threat to really have a bargaining chip either. And I think in a lot of situations, if we look at like voting laws, for example, you know, there's a lot of work around, you know, poor whites being grandfathered into having the franchise, but there are also just lots of laws that still disenfranchise plenty of poor whites as well. So I'm not sure that, you know, yeah, I haven't really quite settled yet. It's an open question, like how much political power did poor whites really have in Jim Crow society? And I think I just need to wrestle with that a little bit more. I think that is a really important topic.
And Vanessa?
Okay, let me take a lead here. Okay, thank you very much. These are all very constructive comments, and we could pretty much, I've made a list, but it would be great to have your slides because all of them are very constructive suggestions that I hope we can take on board, and either way could be very interesting. So let me take them one by one very quickly. I think your point about exposure to Christian missions is very important. And I was actually, while I was playing with this Afrobarometer data, I noticed that the Christian missions variables in the non-AER paper, the 2011 paper, was highly statistically significant, right? And they are included in our regression models. But it'd be good to see, at least for the Afrobarometer level, where we have this data, what happens if you were to exclude the Christian missions? Does the slavery impact become stronger? And in fact, to treat some of those variables as dependent variables and see how slavery is impacting those Christian missions variables. Thank you also for suggesting your paper, which we will read with detail and with great interest, but also some of these new data sources, because when we looked at Christian missions data, cross-country data, we had only 24 countries, but we'll try and explore these new avenues. Thinking about regressions prior to 1970, in this context is very simple. We can just regress an early literacy variable, which we might actually have done that before, which was education, 10 years after independence. I don't remember what the results were, but we could do that. You're absolutely right about the instruments being related to trade, apart from Christian missions, but both in Afrobarometer sort of regressions, but also cross-country regressions, there are lots of sort of basic, whether you're a landlocked country, what is your distance from coast to navigable river, those sorts of variables are accounted for, but we can look at more detail. Actually, in terms of the regional fixed effects, all regional fixed effects are included in cross-country stuff, not just North Africa. But certainly in the Afrobarometer data set, we need to control for these sort of regional categories if possible. I don't know whether the results will survive the country fixed effect, but it'd be interesting to explore. In terms of F-stats for IV regressions, well, if you have more than one instrument, my econ training tells me probably it's not a good idea to just rely on F-stat. That's why Sargans and others are reported, but you're absolutely right. There are a lot of new methods, Anderson and other sort of diagnostic tests that we could include using the IVREC2 commandance data. We'll do that. Problems of bad controls, yes, always there, cross-country regressions. I think we need to recognize that and carefully discuss it and make amends wherever possible. Your question on malaria ecology is absolutely spot on. I mean, malaria ecology, my sense is, at least in the cross-country work, is more like picking up the effect of a possible confounding factor. So, it's a kind of, in the work that Jeff Sachs and others have done, they presented more as a sort of underlying, geographic conditions that determine malaria presence, right? So it's not mal-fal variable or falcrum variable. It's a more sort of predetermined, potentially exogenous variable, as Jeff Sachs and others argue. But at least I think in the Afrobarometer survey regressions, you could see that we don't have good health measures at that level. Maybe in DHS data we might get. So in the absence of those, malaria ecology is probably picking up not just confounding factors, potential mechanisms too, the sort of health dimensions, and that's something we will explore in weeks to come. But this is extremely useful. Really thankful to you, and look forward to receiving your slides.